In the recent 3.2 Archon story quest, we rescue Nahida, learn more about her backstory, and defeat the pompous pretender god Scaramouche. Throughout the story, while it's made pretty clear who is the hero and who is the villain, this concept becomes grayer when we examine it in more detail. While Nahida and Scaramouche appear as polar opposites, what we learn is that their duality belies a rather similar origin story. If this is true, how did they end up being on completely opposite sides? Before we get into that though, if you want to see more Genshin Impact content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Now if you haven't played the Archon story yet, then obviously you would want to come back later as we will dive into some spoilers here, so consider this your spoiler warning. During the story of 3.2, Nahida, the god of wisdom, stands in opposition to Scaramouche, the everlasting lord of arcane wisdom. While these two titans faced off in a battle of gods, they could have just as easily end up on the same side. In order to understand why this might be possible, we first need to fully understand their origins and experiences. So let's first start with Nahida. Nahida's origin is rather unique, as we found out during the 3.2 Archon quest that she was created from a branch of the Irminsul tree. The previous Dendro Archon, Rukkhadevata, did this as she had been corrupted by forbidden knowledge and needed someone to completely erase her so that the Irminsul could properly heal. She also needed a replacement as she could no longer continue to serve as Sumeru's Dendro Archon. Because of the overlap between Rukkhadevata's death and the birth of Nahida, the sages of the Academia assumed that Nahida was a newborn god. They unfortunately lost faith in her due to her lack of knowledge and ability, so they just decided to lock her away. From this point, Nahida could only interact with the outside world through dreams and the Akasha terminal, as she still had dominion over those areas despite being locked up. As tragic as Nahida's origins were, Scaramouche is an equal contender. When the Electro Archon Raiden A began pursuing the concept of eternity, she started creating puppets to act as her intermediary. She wanted to seclude herself in the plane of Euthymia and needed someone else to run the day-to-day of Inazuma as well as be the carrier of her gnosis. Scaramouche was her first attempt at this. Unfortunately, he was considered a failure due to his seemingly gentle nature, and Raiden felt he would not be strong enough to shoulder this burden. At first, she intended to simply destroy him, but because he had sentience, she felt bad and instead released him without any memory of who or what he was, let alone his true purpose. Unfortunately though, this innate need or desire to obtain a gnosis was inherently still present in Scaramouche and became the core of his sense of being. He would end up roaming Inazuma after this and experience life, but it eventually turned sour. Both Scaramouche and Nahida at this point might have started off their life in tragedy, but they would ultimately end up in different places purely because of how they interacted with others. The main difference between them is that one of them embraced her connection with her people, or at least tried to, while the other was abandoned, pushed away, and left to deal with things he did not understand. Now, despite having rather tragic backstories, the way their story diverges from here is why both Nahida and Scaramouche ended up opposing one another. While she was imprisoned, Nahida was still fascinated by humans. She thought that they had rather interesting lives, and as she had no grasp on human emotions, she found it interesting to watch them. To her, humans represented something beyond logic, and the presence of emotions will always add an extra layer of unknown when dealing with people. She would spend her time learning and watching them via the Akasha and would occasionally talk and play with human children in their dreams. On top of that, she still knew that she was the Archon of Sumeru and wanted to live up to that name. So Nahida had a desire to improve herself so that one day she could hold the title of Archon proudly. Despite being imprisoned, Nahida tried spending as much time as she could amongst her people and attempted to understand them to the best of her abilities. Even though some humans had locked her away, she still saw that there was good in them and wanted to help those who were in need regardless of how she was being treated. Nahida also had the benefit of the Akasha, as whatever she didn't understand could just be referred to in the knowledge base of the terminal itself. She eventually learned a lot about humanity and even while trapped was able to understand the intricacies of human relationships. Scaramouche on the other hand had experienced the complete opposite thing. After being abandoned, he would travel Inazuma meeting random people, and to his credit, he did try to form relationships with them. Eventually though, because of his inexperience with emotions and how the world worked, his interactions with humans always ended up in misunderstandings. I'll give you one example of how disconnected he was from reality. On one occasion, he had befriended a human boy. He was fond of the child and enjoyed his company. Eventually, a promise was made between the two friends, but the boy ended up dying. Now, instead of grieving, Scaramouche saw this instead as a betrayal, as the boy could no longer keep his promise. It's difficult to blame Scaramouche in this case though, as he had no guidance on how the world worked or even understood the emotions he felt. This sort of dissonance would repeat many times until he was fed up with the world and found himself in the company of the Fatui. Now you could also argue that Nahida did not start off understanding emotions, but she eventually learned, right? Well, again, it's a tough comparison to make. See, while Nahida did have a weak grasp on human emotions, the way she learned was mostly through proxy, meaning that there was no consequences to getting something wrong. If she misread an emotion, no one would know it was her, as it either happened in a dream, in the body of someone else, or she just saw it through the Akasha. Scaramouche, on the other hand, had to learn it in the real world, where misunderstandings are commonplace with how emotional humans really are. At the end of the day, each of these two gods were the culmination and product of their experiences. I'm not making a case here in defending either of them, one way or the other. I'm simply saying that while they both started out almost the same way, it's the experiences they had which caused them to diverge and end up where they are now. And this is why their story is so compelling. They are both opposite sides of the same coin. Both created under unusual circumstances, both chasing after a purpose, but only one finding it purely because of the right circumstances and having the right group of friends. Perhaps this is why the story has not completely killed off Scaramouche. As much of a villain as he was really just a product of the world he lived in. I think that most of us can see through his journey, the traveler has improved the world in more ways than one. And in today's world, perhaps Scaramouche would have had a completely different ending. This might also be why the traveler's sibling has asked the traveler to push forward in their own journey. Perhaps the traveler's siblings are also experiencing the world differently through their individual experiences, and may end up in a similar confrontation we see between Scaramouche and Nahida, mirroring this duality. But that's a story for another day. If you enjoyed the video, do consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video, and I'll see you in the next one. And as usual, have a nice day.